Welcome to everyone around the world watching us this evening, and I hope in years to come. Here we are celebrating Noor Riyadh, a Riyadh art program. We are here today with James, Clar and Iván Navarro, who are joining us from truly around the world also. We wish we could be with you in real life, in person, in Riyadh, but of course, this is not the moment. For those of you who have been able to see these incredible works in person, we're so glad that you were able to visit and to experience being under one sky. The theme can't be more perfect considering we are actually here joining you underneath one very large sky around the world. We have Ivan in New Mexico, James in Manila, and me here in the United States also. As you can see, a very wintry day behind me, probably very different to what you're looking at in Riyadh at the moment. This Noor Riyadh Festival has really been bringing us together under the theme of light, under one sky, but that idea of light through the darkness, I think, is something so special, welcoming us all. We're going to begin today speaking with Ivan, and then we're going to have a discussion with James, and then really kind of bring it all together and listen to these two incredible voices talking to us about light, sculpture, and painting. Ivan, I would love to hear, please, about your work Podium. For those of us who haven't been able to see it in person yet, perhaps you can just tell us a little bit about your journey. I know that your work has really kind of transgressed so many different aspects, and I've been lucky enough to see it in person at Art Basel over the years and at many different museums and galleries. So I think, really hearing how you've come to this point of working in such a public way with Podium, but then also, this discussion of working in more domestic settings, working with galleries and institutions.
Yes, well, thank you for the invitation. I'm very glad to be part of this conversation. This work, Podium, was made about 4 years ago, and it's actually it's possible to also do a performance with the piece. So the piece has an interactive aspect. The idea, Podium, as you know, in sports, is the place where competitors use to show their position in the competition, right? So it's a very interesting, for me, it's an interesting situation how this object showed the different position in a social activity, and I like to bring that to the space, to the show, and hopefully people will use this piece and step on it, because it's possible to use it as an actual functional object. Now, inside the piece, there is a play of mirrors that creates a black hole inside the piece. And that's the point where I feel that the piece become as an interesting object. Like, what is the contrast between the three-dimensional object and the virtual space that the piece creates inside? And everything is very abstract, but there is a combination of something that we recognize as an object, as a podium, and then we compare that idea with the virtual abstract space that the piece creates inside. And those two situations are the theme of the piece.
So this idea almost like of a mystery, I think, we discussed that, this idea of mystery or mysticality, of, a mystical space. So the black hole, and, as I said in my introduction, this idea of light through the dark. So you have dark here through the light.
Yes, and the idea of mystery is something that is actually it's something that I've been studying recently, and it has a lot to do. It's a cosmic idea. It has a lot to do with what do we think is the origins of the universe, mm-hmm. and how we always try to invent theories, and there are so many mythologies about how to explain the universe. And I'm totally fascinated by those ideas, because they're all like human theories that no one knows exactly what is the real origin of the universe. And I think that mystery has a lot to do with art at the same time. and how we try to explain something that we are the only one who add meanings to certain things and add content to the objects. And the same way people for the longest time, for the history of civilization, try to add meaning to the void. And the void is the universe. And I love that idea, that how the pieces can have a similarity to this cosmic.
Like a cosmic moment, a cosmic situation. So just explain again. So this is a piece that you can step on, you're saying. So we're looking at it, of course, in a on a screen. So, but it's actually on the floor.
Yeah, it's on the floor, and it has a very thick glass, so people are welcome to step on the piece and experience to be on top of the black hole.
So that's also, I think, something really important to kind of examine the context in which you're showing this piece. This is in the Light Upon Light exhibition within the context of Noor Riyadh. And, there have been record numbers of visitors, and I think so heartening. And it's something I've shared with, kind of my wider art community around the world, that, there is this hunger for experiencing art and being at something in real life. And, we talked a little bit about the difference in showing something in a public art context as opposed to in a gallery space or an institutional space. And I think particularly because, as we know, Saudi is experiencing these kind of enormous changes in a really positive way of now having more and more public art festivals and gallery shows and, a Ministry of Culture that didn't exist, before 2018, this idea of really supporting culture and the arts in a public space. So perhaps tell us, and I think even for me, who, is somebody who's like an art world veteran, but the difference of an artist working with a gallery or in a domestic setting or in a public setting, I think you have a really interesting take on that.
The times I've worked in public spaces connected to an institution most of the time, there is a sense of a democratic aspect that I think is very important to accomplish, because when you work in a public space, there are many regulations that you have to respect, because it's open to everyone. So the piece has to be safe for the people, even if people try to claim on it. You have to make sure that the piece won't fall apart. But there is as I say, a democratic aspect that we have to understand is everybody's going to see the piece, and the piece has to be accessible to everyone. And that's the biggest difference when you show a piece in a different context, in a gallery context. Even in a museum context, where the public is a way more specific public, and the public is more trained in the contemporary art. When you see art and they make connection to art history, to other artists or social problems, etc. But when the piece is open to the public, it's in the street, you don't know who's going to see the piece. And that is the most beautiful and the biggest challenge that the piece can face, to be understood in different ways by different people. And I think that's such a good point, because I think we so often hear about these controversies, related to public sculpture, and as we know, this idea of statues and, who does it mean, to who, really? What does it mean to who? And so this idea of different contexts, and, as we know, that the title of this conversation is Light, Sculpture, and Painting, and light and sculpture is almost one in your work. Well, it is one in many works. Mm-hmm. And it is a very different experiencing work than just looking at it in the context of a museum or a gallery where you have or a painting on a wall. So how do you kind of approach that? The difference between, what we sometimes think of as traditional, in a traditional sense, art is a painting on a wall. Yeah, there is let's say when there is a museum, in a museum situation, there is also a very educational program connected to a museum. So usually when you have a piece in a museum, there is also an explanation about the museum, about the piece, okay? And I think that limits the understanding and the openness that the piece can have or can create within the public. Where if you see a piece in the street And sometimes people who are not familiarized with art, they ask themselves, what is this? Is this art? But it looks like it could be an advertising, it could be design, but it still, art has the capacity to make people to get people's attention. You know, even if they don't understand what it is. Art is always something mysterious, right? So I think that is it's very important to be able to, to express that, and to have the piece can be open and in both places, can be can be able to express something in a museum that is not necessarily what the text is saying next to the piece, and then outdoors can be just something that people just start fantasizing about it.
In the Instagram generation, it's definitely also things that I've been spending some time in Los Angeles, and the Beverly Hills sign is so iconic, and you just you walk by there all the time and see people kind of enjoying and taking pictures. And I think actually in the context of COVID, in this extraordinary year we've gone through, public art has been something so, a relief, because it's actually something you could experience this year. You couldn't go to galleries or museums in many places around the world, yet you could go outside and experience things that were, there for the public to see and experience. Have you thought differently about your work in that context this year?
Yeah, of course. Actually, I've have the piece that actually we are seeing right now on the screen. Is a very large public art piece in San Francisco, and it was open to the public in May last year, May 2020. At the beginning, basically not at the beginning, but in the very difficult times of the pandemic. And the people who commissioned that piece, they asked me to go to San Francisco. So I flew to San Francisco in May. The plane was completely empty, and but we did open it. And I think it was more like we need to do this for the people and for us. We need to keep doing art. We need to keep making art circulate in people's mind, not just through Instagram, not just social media, because it's very alienated at the same time. But we need to show this to people in real life, as a real piece, physically.
Well, I realize my sweater is matching your piece right now. That was totally on purpose.
Yeah.
No, I agree, and I think it was so comforting. So I spent, most of the kind of initial period of lockdown in London. And being able to walk around the city, we were lucky in the sense that, we didn't have a ban on being outside, I know, as other places did, but, we were able to walk around and experiencing things just like in a public space, being in Hyde Park and seeing things, that we saw outside of the Serpentine, or, outside of Tate Modern, just to see, art from around the world on the outside of Tate Modern. It was just such an important thing to kind of experience the beauty of public art in a city. And I think that a lot of people really took great comfort in that. So well done you for being able to bring that joy to people in San Francisco in May.
Thank you.
And I think, on that note, I'd love to turn to James and talk to you about, I think as Iván, actually perfect segue into talking about the virtual world. I know that a lot of your work, and this work in particular, you said render tree, focusing on that. And so perhaps tell us in the audience, of those who haven't been able to see it, but who we can see some images and hear you discuss it.
Yeah, so the work that's being exhibited right now at the Light Upon Light exhibition is called Render Tree. And what it is it's a sculptural light piece, an array of lights kind of coiling around a tree that's been cast upside down in resin. So it has this kind of organic sense of kind of being formulated. The title itself is called Render Tree, so it's like a line of code. So in code, you would write render, and then parentheses, marks, whatever object you might be rendering, and then you have kind of end colon. So the title is kind of rendering this tree. I was thinking about a lot of the works are kind of creating this kind of virtual dream space or virtual world. So it's taking these kind of aesthetic from a virtual space and then recreating it within our space. So it's kind of how technology's it's kind of like faded or kind of blurred the boundary between virtual space and real life space. So render tree is this tree that's being rendered in a hologram. So if we think of ourselves as kind of being in a simulation, then in this sculpture, you're seeing the simulation being rendered in real time and kind of frozen at the moment of freezing.
Are we in a simulation period of the world this year? I think 2020 and now coming into a little bit of 2021, it seems like we're living in a simulated world completely.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a lot of the information that we get in our daily lives is from these kind of technological systems. And you and I right now are talking through, through the internet and through this kind of visual system of the screen. And so it is simulated, I mean, I'm not physically tangibly there, but we're having a conversation like we are, so what you're looking at and what you're talking to isn't me. It's just like a simulation of me transferred through the internet and then onto your screen and vice versa.
Yeah. I mean, we were talking a little bit, you mentioned you have a 13-year-old, and I have been spending some time with my godchildren who are slightly younger, but obsessed with Minecraft. And I think this younger generation this year has been, we've talked about, the problems of homeschooling around the world and kind of parental issues really with that. How do you see your work, especially because Saudi Arabia is such a young population, kind of being able to show it in that context in, at Light Upon Light in Noor Riyadh? Is it something, you thought about, differently, the way in which that would be received, this idea of a virtual experience or rendering?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think our relationship with each other or with our physical space is changing as, we rely more and more on technology. So, being physically present isn't as important as it was before because we can communicate the way that we can, even now, this wasn't possible maybe 10 years ago. So, kids who grew up with the internet and with these kind of social media tools, for them, it's not as important, to be physically there or to not be. And the crossover between these virtual spaces and real spaces, the distinction between that is less. So I definitely think that areas that are just adapting to new technologies, they're communicating in different ways. You mentioned Instagram and social media. I mean, Instagram is such a visual medium, and so it's interesting to see how young kids are now communicating through, they're filmmakers. They're communicating through the language of film, the way they edit things around.
I just interrupt you right there because I was woken up this morning at 5 a.m. by a group of children who are practicing a Frozen parody, and they're doing a film and a screening for our entire household. So yes, I have actually experienced this idea of the obsession with filming and the virtual world and all of the rest of it.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing. It's wild that these tools are so accessible to kids nowadays. So the way that they communicate, is different. They're not making flip books. They're making films or, even the prevalence of emojis. Emojis are, I might not be able to speak other people's languages, but I can understand pictures, and so that's why emojis are so popular because they can express something of human nature, but reduce it down to a picture, yeah.
But actually on that subject, I mean, you discussed that your work, unfortunately, you haven't been able to see it in the show, but you have, of course, seen images, not just of your individual work, but the context in which it's shown. So that is actually the problem of the virtual world, is that we don't see the context in which the curator has really thoughtfully put this together, and the team, and even you and your discussions with artists. Your work, you said, is placed next to Raphael Lozano Hemmer, also an artist I know the work well and have seen, and I would love to be able to see that. And then actually it brings a greater understanding to your work and to his, in the entire context of the exhibition and what's trying to be communicated. So, perhaps we can talk a little bit about that perception and that idea of the virtual world, but how do we see things in context if we're only seeing them, individually?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a good point. I think, even though there are these tools for us to communicate with each other through long distance and through the screen, I mean, screen is still the screen, and the medium of the screen is still always going to be two-dimensional. There's always going to be a pixel aspect ratio. There's going to be, all these kind of issues, and it has a way different experience from seeing something physically in real life. And when you're talking about like the exhibition, I think like the layout of the exhibition also, has kind of a narrative or a story. The way the curator kind of lays things out, you're in this immersive environment. And I think that's kind of an interesting thing, is that like, you talk about like Minecraft or these video games. It's interesting to see the exhibition as these kind of artificial light sources or these virtual spaces in a physical space, because it's almost, in one way you could say that you're walking through a virtual space in real life, going through the exhibition.
Sorry, explain that last point. You're walking through a virtual space in real life. You mean being there?
Yes. Yeah. If you go to the exhibition, it's like you're walking through, as you mentioned, my work is next to Raphael Lozano Hammer. He has a giant sun piece, and then my piece has this tree next to it. So there's kind of this relationship and this kind of, the way they kind of pair together. The exhibition kind of ends in this kind of virtual space with both of our pieces together. So you have this kind of simulation of a sun, and then the simulation of organic life kind of growing from the sun.
Mm-hmm. So, I'm extremely involved with the Tate Modern, Tate in general, but Tate Modern in particular. The idea of art being shown alongside each other from different parts of the world has been, I think, a hugely, art history changing, kind of dogma changing aspect of what the Tate has done. So instead of having a Middle Eastern gallery or an Asian gallery, it's art within the context of, of themes and that thematic idea, rather than really separating the world into, ethnicities or geographies. So for you, this idea of perception of reality and the visual and sensory, are you really trying to break that down also, not just in terms of geography, but in terms of our own sensory, aspects? We're looking right now at rain under lamppost. Mm-hmm. What does that mean in the context of how people see and experience it?
Right. So, Rain Under Lamppost, the piece that's being shown now, is kind of recreating the effect of rain going through a cone of light created from the lamppost. So it's almost like you're looking at your window while it's raining, and you're seeing kind of this noise field going through a geometry of light. And it's created through a projector that's intentionally twisted sideways. So half of the image goes onto the wall and then onto the floor. And then I split the video image so it's showing the vertical image of water or rain, and then the horizontal image of rain. But I think, some of the works are my background is film. And so I'm trying to approach things more narratively or emotionally. And I think, even though that we're relying a lot on technology, or, I'm utilizing a lot of technology in my works, I think that the human is still the most important thing, how we feel about a work or how it connects to us. And I think that's that's global. It has nothing to do with nationalities or borders. That has more to do with how people feel and think.
I think that's actually a perfect way to now. I'd love to open a conversation between James and Ivan, and really talk to you both about how, I think what you talked about, the idea of ornamentation, the use of patterns, within the context of what you're both trying to achieve and really translate to an audience, going from a really interactive world to a virtual world. And both of your work really requires the viewer and a participant almost. So I'd love to hear you kind of speak that way about creating magic. We hope that people got to see it even just through the screen, but in real life.
Yeah, I'm interested in basically the idea of repetition and I use different, ways of showing different techniques or different neon designs in order to show the idea of repetition and creating patterns. With patterns, especially in science, is a way of understanding things, and creating facts, which is a totally mysterious thing to me also, because when a pattern became a pattern, it became a real, something that we can understand as a behavior, right? Mm-hmm. So when I use patterns, I'm interested in when the patterns actually disappear and they became nothing, they dissipate in space. Mm-hmm. So they became meaningless. And that is an act of perception, because you can only see that visually, and I see in James' work that how I think you are also interested in repetition, and many loops I see in your work. Maybe you have an idea behind that.
Yeah. I mean, I think similarly to how you approach the patterns and them going off into infinity or repeating, there's an element of repeating, especially for like the video pieces or even some of the reductionist light pieces. It's almost like it's kind of things in stasis. You're trying to see like how things change, but you're commenting about that change itself. So you're not really trying to get from A to B. You're just talking about the process of change or that process of like transition.
Yeah, I think I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, please go ahead.
No. I'm saying that I think the thing that connects us is the visual perception of the piece. Besides whatever that means, is to have that kind of like free entrance to the piece through the perception and through the openness of the piece, and then we both find our own meanings or our background is there, in whatever way. Yeah.
I mean, so the mediums of expression, you've also in our conversations have discussed. So the mediums of expression are important, and the idea of this as a sculptural work also, so that the kind of bringing work together, not just in the virtual world, but as a sculptural piece. So how is it that you translate materials? And I think you both have talked about materiality and almost an economical way of doing things, but yet it's incredibly particular and it's something that's required practice. And as James said, he started in film. So how have you been able to kind of translate the materials and materiality of it?
Go ahead, James.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, for myself, a lot of it came from, as I mentioned, film, but also the idea that you can, you sit in a theater and you're watching a film and it doesn't exist. It's just light bouncing from a screen. But from that light bouncing from a screen, you can start to get a narrative and a story, and you have like an emotional reaction. You can cry at a film. And it's amazing to me that happens when it doesn't even actually exist. The only thing that exists is the light coming from the screen. So think about that, and then you think about like how the medium of film is just, it's set in terms of like it's two-dimensional. Well, maybe there's like other ways that we can manipulate light that also has this kind of emotional reaction. Maybe we can take light away from the screen or start to bend it or apply it sculpturally, and then these sculptures kind of inhabit some sort of concept or meaning or emotion.
Yeah, I mean, for me, the approach has to do with traditional sculpture. I'm interested in certain materials, the process of making, also, as I said, repetition, and I have a very tight connection to printmaking too. It's the idea of reproduce a piece, endlessly, and that concept, when I went to art school, we studied a concept based in printmaking. And that's how it translated into object making, that how we can also understand an object, any object, as a printmaking or as a print even. A cast is a print.
Does that also relate to perhaps your idea of like this idea of a democratic process? I mean, you're an artist that works in, amongst institutions and galleries, and you were talking about this idea of like in a gallery, you feel you have freedom because you, through your conversation with the gallerist, can, really show almost whatever you want, and then it's available to a public to also take home with them. Is that something that you think has influenced this idea of printmaking also? And how do you work in gallery shows?
I mean, that's how it started in my, the theory of my work. Like it's totally connected to objects that can be reproduced, and also objects to use everyday objects, like ready-made objects, and you make it in a way more recognizable as assemblage of objects. Now, when it comes to making more accessible to people, it also facilitates the idea sometimes to make editions. When you make editions when you work with a gallery and you make 4 pieces of the same, and then yes, collectors, it's not just one unique piece. I you know, and I think for me that is connected to my background as a printmaker. It's not like a commercialization. How can I make more pieces of the same? You know, it really has to do with my background as a printmaker, and I really enjoy that, and I use it as a part of the work. You know, something, you know, like when I use mirrors and the reflection of mirror, it's all about repetition. You know, and then so it's embedded in the work, all those ideas.
I mean, I think that, you know, when I see your work in real life, and, you know, I kind of going, and, you know, through Basel, you always see, you know, people standing in front of your works and so fascinated by these endlessly repeated images of themselves or, you know, their loved ones, and taking pictures of that, and then being able to take that home. And I think, you know, James, we were talking with your work, this idea of the concrete, but yet not the concrete. You know, the idea of time being also very subjective. So when we see those repeated images, and, you know, as Iván described in your work, like the idea of a loop, how does that translate, do you think, in terms of things that are more global? You know, I think we've talked a little bit, what is real time? You know, what is our reality when we see that expressed through your work?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of stuff I mean, I guess like when you start to think about like film, you start to think about also like frame rates. And, you know, I also trained in like animation. So animation, you're always trying to break things down in terms of like frames of time. And I think like these loops, you know, the loops that I use, or the loops that Even uses, you know, these visual loops, you're kind of breaking down these elements of time, and you're putting things into this kind of these infinite spaces. Like I look at like Evan's work, and it's a lot about like also potentiality. I see a lot like the potential for spaces, or the potential for like options. I saw his installation in Venice Biennale, and with the doors and the rainbow colored doors, it's almost like these different pathways and these choices that you can have, you know, these potential spaces or directions that you can go, you know. And I think that's like a lot with like, you know, with light, you're manipulating that. Sorry, what was that?
Is it red pill, blue pill, or what? Yeah. I mean, yeah. So the mediums are important. So I mean, you both work kind of across, you know, across mediums. I mean, obviously there is, let's say, iconic images of your work, both of you, and how you translate that. I mean, how do you kind of come to that realization? I mean, is it that you are given a theme, do you think, or is it, you know, I think a lot of the audience, you know, are really interested in how does one now enter the sphere of being an artist, or being a curator, or, you know, hopefully opening a gallery. And I think in the context of Saudi, being at this kind of precipice of just leaping into the art world and the art world ecosystem. You know, James, you talked about kind of going from, you know, film, and also still working within film in the context of your artwork. But in Iván, you went to art school, and you knew that from a very early age. So what would you say to an audience, you know, of young artists, young gallerists? You know, how does one make those decisions?
Well, for me, it was a very strange decision, because I wasn't interested in studying art. And I just went there for 1 year because of the career that I really wanted to study. My test was extremely low, so I couldn't enter the school that I wanted to go. So I went to art school just for, I said, they were very similar. I wanted to study set design. I was more interested in making theater, working in theaters. And then I said to myself, well, I'll just study for 1 year art, and then I'll move to the other career, because they have very similar credits. But then I realized that being an artist and studying in an art school, the possibilities are way more open than going to a more specific career like graphic design, industrial design, set design, even architecture. And I think the beauty of studying art or being an artist is that you really can find a way to do what you want to do with whatever medium you want to use. And I even when I do visits to students, and they ask me a similar question, and sometimes I talk to them and I say, what is your hobby besides, you know, painting, or besides whatever, besides being in the academia. What is your hobby? Do you collect stamps? Do you collect, like shells in the beach?
Yeah.
And then people say crazy things, what they do as a hobby. And I say, well, that's a possibility in your hands, that you can turn that into your art, because it really could be anything. And that's the most difficult part at the same time, but it's also is the most beautiful one.
James, I'd love to hear also you, because I know, we've crossed paths many times over the years in Dubai, especially in the very early days, kind of at the nascent periods of what was happening in the UAE, through Art Dubai and Al Surcal. So how is it that you kind of came to these realizations?
Yeah, I mean, it is like similar to what Ivan was saying. It's, it's just kind of this curiosity, and you're just inherently curious about how things work. Or, for me, it's like, what do you see? Like, how are you seeing it? What does it mean? And so through those questions, then you start to break things down, and, it became more about light, because everything that you see is light based. But every artist has like a different way of processing their experiences, and then that gets kind of, filtered through and into their work. I think the most important thing for every artist is just kind of be honest with themselves, be honest with like how you think and how you feel. And when you do that, and through that process, as long as you're still critical about what you're thinking, what you're feeling, then you can create works that are original for you, or set you apart from what other artists are doing. And I think that's the most important thing. I mean, like, there's so many artists that have used light, but look at how many different ways we've been utilizing that medium, because that's just like how we feel about it, or how we think. And so the more that you do that, and the more that you create, the more that you start to create this kind of portfolio that's kind of representative of who you are and how you think, and I think that's the most important thing. In order to like insert yourself into the art world, there has to be some sort of new color that you're adding.
And I think in the context also of where you're showing, being in Riyadh, and in a place right now that has one of the only experiences of in real life art. And as we move towards the next phases of the world in this kind of post-COVID situation, like, what are you most looking forward to showing and kind of experiencing and doing? I'd love to hear from both of you in terms of what you like to see in real life, but also what you're looking forward to in your own studios.
Yeah, I'm for the last year, I've been only working in my studio, and I've been going back to all my initial handmade practices, and I start painting again. I mean, not again, for the first time. So this is something very new for me, and I think it's this time, the COVID time, is, at least for me, it made me go back to the studio practice in a more serious way. Really, like creating series of works that I can only make in the studio without the help of fabricators, without the help of high-end technology, because I need that help sometime in order to make work. But since, especially at the beginning of the pandemic, the places were closed, fabricators' shops were closed, I as a necessity, I had to go back to do my own things, to do everything, the whole piece from beginning to end. And it's been very enriching. I've been enjoying that. And also, it also makes you realize that you can do work in your studio. I'm sorry to say this, but you realize that maybe you don't need that institution that much. Maybe you can even start doing shows in your studio, and making that happen, like being more independent of the institutional system, because as we know, in this moment is really suffering in every way. And artists also have to find other ways to do art, to do their work.
Well, that's an interesting one, actually. So we, were speaking actually with Ahmed Mater the other day in the context of Noor Riyadh, and his studio has so often been a hub and a home for artists in Saudi Arabia when there wasn't an institutional setting. And I think that the artist studio in maybe a Western context or a traditional, let's say a traditional context in the recent modern times, hasn't been that. It's been more a closed off place, a place that is just for the artist and their kind of smaller team, or their, a kind of VIP almost situation. So, perhaps COVID is opening up the artist studio space as what we've seen in places that have lacked an institution.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. James, how is this year, in the context of what you're looking forward to or what you've experienced for you?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm looking forward to travel opening up again and kind of, the pandemic and kind of ending. I think for what we do in the arts, a lot of it's based on kind of the social aspect of art is important. And I think it's about the exchange of ideas, so when we travel around and we go to different exhibitions, or we're in this city or that city, you're seeing of what the local kind of idea of arts and culture is. And that, that it influences you and it gets you to think about things, and to have that kind of engagement is important, and I think when I was living in Dubai, or these areas that have an emerging art scene, the identity of these places hasn't been solidified yet. So to become part of that kind of conversation is really important. So you have it in Saudi, or you have it now I'm in Manila. And so to engage with people and just kind of have discussions about what it means to be where you are is an important aspect of arts. It's arts and culture.
We have one question from the audience. Actually, we have a couple, so I've gotten them through. The first one linked to what we were talking about earlier about technology and magic. How are these concepts interlinked? Which is actually something I think was really fascinating on our very early conversation here. So love to hear, art is magic to many people, to me, and I think to, many people who are, kind of obsessed with the idea of what culture and art can bring to us in society and can create magic. So how does technology and magic kind of interface and interlink?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's when you make a piece of art using technology, and the piece is not about technology, it's about art. And that's what is the biggest challenge. When you make technology to work in your favor, and you're not working to make the piece look so technologically advanced. And I think when you put together technology, different kind of technology, because technology could be anything. I mean, technology, we know, is a very archaic term. When we put it together with a meaning, or when the technology is meaningful, that's when it's magic. And that's when both ideas run in parallel. The content is as important and how the piece was made. That's how it works.
Technology in meaning is magic. I think that's a quote to be proliferated. And James, I mean, your work in some ways also, it is like creating that virtual world that we, I think as me would think that when I was younger, that is magic. That is magic, to so many.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you in that I don't really see too much of a distinction between art and magic. I think it's almost the same thing, because you're presenting something to the viewer and you're trying to shift their view of reality. You're trying to get them to see something in a different way from what is normally given as reality. So I think, to me, it's very, very similar.
And how do you both see this idea of proliferating your works on social media? I know we touched upon that a little bit before, but this is another question from the audience, and that, some artists are very reticent about, having that presence. This is a year where that is how we were, I'm not on Instagram famously, but how do you translate that to a social media audience? I mean, do you see that as demeaning to the works in some ways, or do you just try to explain it as fully as you can?
No, I think it only shows one way of seeing it. It really, when you are exposed to that kind of promote your work through social media, unfortunately, it has to look good for the picture, and it has to engage people. So it's really not every piece you make can be seen like that. And for me, really, the meaning of the work, because it's almost like the logic of fashion, like it has to look good, it has to be flashy, it has to get people attention, And sometimes, it has anything to do with the content of the piece. It's all about colors and, So yeah, I'm against it.
Yeah, I'm not actually that staunchly against it. I don't push it as much. I just kind of let it be where it is. And, I'm on Instagram, and, that's kind of the only channel of social media that I have a presence on. But I think it's also just a way of engaging with people who are kind of curious about my work. But it is a different experience, but it's just an easy way. It's an easy channel for like people to kind of see like where exhibitions are and, how to, or just see like kind of backgrounds of like, post pictures or when I'm traveling, and somehow I feel like it reflects the way I see things, so it kind of gives you a little bit like extra insight into the process in some way.
Well, I think that's actually a really great way to say it, is that, both of you, we're here speaking in a virtual forum, but it's about imparting to an audience that meaning and that process and what that means in the context of your work. So yes, great to see these images on screen, but it's also about seeing them in real life and hopefully welcoming people in real life to that exhibition in Riyadh, if you're lucky enough to be there, or when you show at your next gallery show or institution or your artist studio. So Iván, I think, are you welcoming us all to your studio soon?
Definitely. Everybody's welcome. Yeah.
So
I love that idea to go back to the, to open this to the art, the open studio. I think it's been, like for the maybe recent, for the last, 20 years, is something that is not that cool anymore. Everybody wants to have a gallery. Everybody wants to be famous. Everybody wants to be in art fairs and biennials. And the idea of the open studio is being marginalized from the mainstream. And I think it's such an important practice to show people what you do in your studio.
Well, thank you. And thank you, James and Iván, for joining us, and to our audience. We welcome you to watch this. If you'd like to watch it in Arabic, you can go to a YouTube link in Arabic. Of course, here we are speaking in English around the world and under one sky. Hope you can all go experience Noor Riyadh and Light Upon Light in person. And of course, see images, which will never match your experience in real life, but we hope that you can experience these things and really, bring that idea of all of us under one sky. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you.